You have seen the postcards. A perfect ring of stones standing in a manicured English field, a silhouette at sunset that looks like something photographed for a myth rather than for a map. You have been told, in schoolbooks and in documentaries with discrete background strings, that Stonehenge is a Neolithic monument built in stages between about 3000 and 1500 BC, that it played roles in calendrical observation and communal ritual, that it is accounted for by archaeologists who follow strata and radiocarbon dates. But stand here, in the mud after rain, with fog clinging to the fields and the cattle in the distance like sleeping islands, and the clean lines of those textbook summaries begin to feel strangely thin. Something about the place resists tidy explanation. The stones themselves, hewn, transported, balanced, refuse to be merely footnotes in a chapter about agricultural progress. They thrum with questions that archaeology has not answered, with patterns of labor and movement that hint at knowledge and effort so vast that they reframe the people who made them. We will not, in what follows, trade in easy conclusions. Instead, we will walk through the mysteries embedded in the earth and in the stones, the choices people made, the things they moved across hundreds of miles without engines, the deaths and burials that were meaningful enough to be placed beneath giant lintels, the astronomical alignments that might be coincidence, or might be the product of generations of observation. The myths that layered the place until even early modern chroniclers told of giants and lost tribes. I promise you revelations, not the tidy kind that close a chapter and put a period at the end, but the kind that open corridors of wonder and leave a door ajar. I promise that by the end of this journey you will be less sure of what you thought you knew, and more compelled to imagine what people can build when their lives are braided tightly with ritual, with ambition, with memory. Picture yourself first not as a tourist craning a phone above a barrier but as a person walking the chalk landscape in the deep past, when the river valleys were wider, when the oaks had not been cut into fences, when horizon and weather measured time differently. Imagine, too, being a modern investigator, an archaeologist in waterproofs, a geophysicist hunched over a screen reading ghostly reflections from ground-penetrating radar, a geneticist coaxing data from pollen grains the size of pinheads. Both viewpoints matter because the thing we call Stonehenge is both a human-made site and an archive. The stones carry tool marks and lichen. The soil around them preserves charcoal, bone, and seeds. Sometimes the most precise instruments return the most baffling results. Dates that place construction earlier than expected, fragments of foreign flint in a field of chalk, skeletal remains that do not match the simple pattern of a village cemetery. And then there are the stories. Tales told by centuries of inhabitants and visitors. About giants dragging cryptic rocks from Ireland, about rulers and battles, about the sun itself being coaxed into behavior by the hands of men and women. Now, let's be fair, archaeological science has given us huge, reliable things about Stonehenge. We know, with considerable certainty, that some stones, bluestones, came from Wales, from places like the Preseli Hills, more than 140 miles away by some routes. We know that the monument was built in phases, timber circles first, then earthen banks and ditches, then the massive sarsen stones set into trilithons. We know of burials, cremations in particular, that suggest Stonehenge was a place where the dead were brought, possibly to be commemorated or sanctified. Still, for all the evidence, for all the radiocarbon dates and isotope analyses, for all the painstaking excavation grid by grid, a fog of larger questions remains. Why move stones so far? How were they lifted and dovetailed with such precision? What exactly did the alignments mean in the lives of the people who built and rebuilt the place across centuries? And perhaps most unnervingly, what is missing from the record? What was deliberately erased, forgotten, or never preserved? But here's where it gets tricky. Every time we feel we have Stonehenge in focus, a new method or a new theory shifts the picture. Ground-penetrating radar suggests buried features in fields that looked empty. Ancient DNA sometimes shows surprising mobility among populations. Chemical analyses hint at trade routes that were more complex than simple local exchange. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, your breath making small clouds, the land around you with shallow hollows that could be the ghost of long-vanished structures. Hear the soft clink of the morning insects, and imagine drums echoing through the night in a time when sound was a way to gather people across miles. We have to hold both skepticism and wonder, skepticism enough to distrust the seductive simplicity of one neat story, and wonder enough to follow where the artifacts and the patterns lead us. We still don't know, and that is precisely why we keep listening to the stones. Now let us move closer to the first of the long unsolved riddles. At first glance, the tale of Stonehenge's stones is a logistics problem. Why and how were massive blocks transported from distant places and erected in careful, interlocking designs? The one-sentence truth you can hold in your mind is this: Stonehenge's core stones were not local, and the effort to move them rewrites what we assumed about prehistoric mobility. The sarsen stones, the enormous upright blocks capped by lintels, are made of a hard sandstone that outcrops in the Marlborough Downs, perhaps only a few miles from the monument, but the smaller bluestones tell a stranger story. Those bluestones, which weigh up to 4 tons apiece, come from the Preseli Hills of West Wales, and that means people either moved stones across rivers and lowlands for more than 100 miles, or these stones were acquired through complex networks of exchange that covered vast distances in an age without pack animals or wheeled vehicles as we understand them in later periods. Historical context is important. We are talking about a time frame that begins around 3000 BC for the earliest earthworks associated with Stonehenge and continues in significant building phases up to about 1500 BCE. The culture that made these choices, what we now class with broad labels like Late Neolithic and Early Bronze Age, had craft skills, maritime and riverine knowledge, and social structures capable of organizing large groups of labor. Measurements matter here. Some of the sarsen uprights stand more than 20 feet tall and weigh perhaps 25 tons or more. The logistics of quarrying, transporting along the chalk plateaus, dragging through marshy fenlands, and raising such megaliths into a mortise and tenon connection with horizontal lintels. This is a scale of social investment that suggests shared meanings and purposes beyond simple monumentality. Key discoveries complicate our assumptions. Excavations have revealed tools and traces of wooden sledges. Geophysical surveys indicate possible processional ways that connect the River Avon to the monument. Isotope analyses of human remains from burials in the surrounding landscape suggest people in the Stonehenge complex included migrants from distant regions, implying not only the movement of objects but also the movement of people and ideas. Competing theories attempt to make these facts cohere. One theory says that the bluestones were transported intact by human effort, pulled on rollers, dragged across land on sledges lubricated with animal fat, or floated on rafts for parts of the journey. This view requires an enormous mobilization of manpower across generations, an unbroken chain of work that implies leadership structures capable of sustained projects. Another theory, which gained traction in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, suggests that glacial action might have carried some of these stones closer to Salisbury Plain during the Ice Age, making the job of prehistoric people more about gathering locally available erratics rather than hauling stones over great distances. Yet another proposes a sort of hybrid model. People did move some stones deliberately, while others might have been obtained more locally but were chosen precisely because they carried symbolic value or particular acoustic or aesthetic properties. Still, for all the evidence about quarry sites and Preseli, quarries where facets of stone were worked and where scars matched the bluestones at Stonehenge, we are left with a stubborn question: why choose those particular stones at all? What did a block of spotted dolerite from a distant hill mean to a community centuries before recorded history? Myths overlay the practical. Geoffrey of Monmouth and later chroniclers would talk of giants moving stones from Ireland, an echo of notice that these stones felt otherworldly to later peoples. Tales of giants or sea-voyaging ancestors who brought sacred stones fuse with the physical reality of ancient transport to create a narrative that is both mythic and logistical. Picture yourself at the Preseli outcrops, rain sharpening the colors, standing at the lip of a quarry and imagining teams of people carving, levering, and hauling, voices barking commands, children running ahead to scout the route. There is a reflective insight here. The transportation of stones suggests a communal imagination so capacious that people would devote lifetimes to a project that tied together landscape, memory, and identity. We still don't know whether the act was primarily practical, primarily symbolic, or an intimate layering of both. But here's where it gets trickier. Recent techniques, high-precision geochemistry, for example, have tried to match specific bluestones to specific spots in Presili, and the matches are sometimes tantalizingly precise, indicating not vague regional sourcing but direct links between named outcrops and named blocks at Stonehenge. If a given rock finger can be traced back to a single tooth in a Welsh quarry, then the story of movement becomes less a matter of folklore and more a geography of intentionality. Still, other analyses muddy the water. Some stones do not have clean matches, and some materials may have been repurposed or reshaped in ways that erase their original signatures. Now imagine the social life of those stones. Perhaps each had an origin story sung by households as they labored. Perhaps each stone represented a treaty with a kin group from a distant valley. The rational explanations, engineering capacity, social coordination, are not incompatible with mythic readings. In fact, their coexistence is part of the monument's power. We are left not with a single narrative but with concentric ones, like rings of stone themselves. We still don't know which of these concentric narratives held sway most strongly in any given era. Another angle is more human and intimate. The construction and transport imply the lives of individuals, the gravediggers, the quarrymen, the women who cooked for the laborers, the ritual specialists who mediated the meanings. Archaeology occasionally gives us glimpses: butchered animal bones in pits used for feasting, charred grain that suggests seasonal gatherings, human remains showing healed fractures and repetitive stress on bones from carrying heavy loads. But we lack the written records that would let us read intent. So human labor remains ghosted by measurements and broken tools. Imagine being one of those people, standing on a low hill watching the procession of ropes and sledges as a bluestone slides past. Imagine tasting smoke from hearth fires and the metallic tang of sharpened flint. There is a reflective note. The monument is a composite of many small, almost anonymous acts of service and sacrifice, acts that, in their totality, created something larger than any single maker's goal. We still don't know the names of those people, but the stones keep an echo of their toil. Beyond movement, there is the mystery of purpose. Some scholars emphasize astronomical alignments: the summer solstice sunrise that shines along the avenue toward the heel stone, the orientation that suggests careful tracking of solar events. Other scholars caution against overreading. Alignments can happen by chance, and deliberately selecting for a few harmonious directions might ignore the broader social functions of the site. The truth is probably both. That astronomical observation was part of a package of meanings that included ancestor veneration, territorial display, and social cohesion. Theories about purpose range from practical calendar keeping, important for agricultural cycles, to complex ritual use, where the stones served as a stage for staged cosmologies. A mythic account says the monument was a portal to other realms, a place where the living and the dead conversed. Picture yourself there at dawn, fog turning to light, the stones casting low, long shadows, and notice how easily the body aligns with the sun's arc. That bodily alignment may help explain the human impulse to mark solstices with architecture. Still, for all the alignments and for all the feasts and cemeteries, the core of Stonehenge resists any single-purpose explanation. We still don't know which of these purposes dominated in which century. As you stand back from the stones and consider transportation, labor, and purpose, another mystery waits underfoot: the sequence of construction itself. Stonehenge is not a single-built monument but a palimpsest of constructions and reconstructions over more than a millennium. The earliest features, long barrows and cursus monuments, tell of an evolving landscape of ritual action. The timber circles that preceded the stone phases decay in the record, but their post holes suggest outlines of meaning. Over time, the monument's core was rearranged, stones were removed, re-erected in new configurations, and some were broken and repurposed. Why would a community dismantle or alter a sacred space? One possibility is changing cosmologies, new priestly doctrines and social alliances demanding different symbolic architectures. Another is simple mechanical necessity: stones fell, cracks appeared, and practicality demanded reshaping. But the timing of some alterations raises other questions. why would a large communal investment be undone less than a generation later? Alternatively, could the modifications mark shifts in population, arrivals of new groups who wanted to make a mark or assert legitimacy? Mythic narratives imagine curses placed on stones, or new kings stamping authority by reconfiguring sacred landscapes. Picture, again, the field at dusk, a line of torches along a row of men and women levering a lintel into place, chanting words whose meaning we cannot know. The reflective insight is that sacred landscapes are as much about negotiation as about continuity. We still don't know the full story behind each rearrangement. And if we think timber, stone, movement, and ritual exhaust the questions, there remains the enigma of buried things, human remains, animal offerings, and objects of art that lie beneath and around Stonehenge in patterns that do not always match our expectations. Cremation burials, sometimes placed deliberately within sockets near the stones, make archaeologists ask whether Stonehenge functioned as a center for the treatment of the dead. Yet, other burials in the area suggest high-status individuals were commemorated in barrows farther away, indicating a landscape of multiple, overlapping funerary practices. There are also enigmatic deposits, pits filled with hearth ash and bone, sometimes with carefully placed objects, sometimes with fragments that seem to have been deliberately broken. Competing theories see these as votive offerings, as refuse from feasting, as boundary markers, or as the remnants of competitive displays of prestige. The mythic overlay tells of sacred sacrifices to an unseen power. Picture the careful hands that divided meat, the smoke, the smell of herbs, the low murmurs of prayer. Reflectively, the pattern suggests that the monument's meaning was enacted through repeated, bodily practice, eating, speaking names, burning, burying. We still don't know the specific rituals or the full cosmology that structured those acts. Finally, in this segment of mystery we cannot omit the strange human remains discovered nearby, skeletons with unusual proportions, bones showing healed ceremonial injuries, and isotopic signatures that suggest individuals who traveled widely in life. Sensational accounts, giants, lost tribes, even theories of extraterrestrial architectures, have a long afterlife in popular storytelling. We must balance the seduction of sensational narratives with methodological caution. Giant skeleton claims are, as a rule, unsupported by verifiable catalogued remains and often stem from misinterpretation or hoax. Yet the existence of genuinely unusual burials, people with outlier DNA or with objects from distant lands, reminds us that prehistoric Britain was not isolated. People moved, traded, intermarried, and carried stories and objects across long distances. Picture a traveler arriving at Stonehenge from an island coast, wearing ornaments of a style different from local craft, speaking a tongue unfamiliar to the ear. The reflective point is that Stonehenge absorbed diversity, and that diversity may be central to its power as a gathering place. We still don't know how those cosmopolitan threads wove into everyday ritual meaning. Even writing this, a single long sweep through the problem of stone movement, social labor, and burial practice, feels like trying to trace the silhouette of a complex animal in twilight. There are edges we can touch, quarry marks, isotopic ratios, radiocarbon ranges, and there are deep shadows where the human heart must be imagined. But the lack of absolute answers is not, in itself, failure. It is an invitation to keep asking, to hold both scientific rigor and mythic imagination in the same hand. Picture the stones again as you walk away, their surfaces rough, their edges softened by lichen, the light shifting. Imagine the many hands and voices that once circled them, the rituals that once clothed them with meaning, the arguments over which stone should stand where. We still don't know precisely why any given stone ended up where it is, but perhaps this is the point. Stonehenge is less a solved puzzle than a continuing conversation between past and present, between the resources of empirical science and the mysteries that refuse to be reduced to data points. The stones at Stonehenge have long been read as a giant clock carved into the landscape, the monument, and its alignments daringly intimate with the rhythms of sun and moon, and this is the mystery that keeps astronomers, archaeoastronomers, and lay stargazers returning. How precise were these alignments, and what did they mean in the daily lives of the people who shaped them? Picture the site as a kind of celestial theater, the heel stone catching the first light of the summer solstice, the avenue channeling sunrise like a funnel, and certain sight lines that seem to mark not only the solstices but subtle lunar standstills that repeat on cycles longer than a human lifetime. Historical context frames this as a long conversation between people and sky. The phases of construction we can date with reasonable confidence: earthworks and timber circles near 3000 BC, the erection of bluestones around 2900 to 2500 BC, and the finished Sarsen circle and trilithons roughly 2500 to 2000 BC. Took place in a world where agriculture was increasingly central, seasons mattered vitally for survival, and observation of celestial events could be a practical tool for timing sowing and harvest. Measurements are precise enough to make anyone's head swivel. The axis of Stonehenge aligns within a degree or so of the midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset, and the monument sits on an avenue that leads to the River Avon, a natural corridor that may have been used for processions timed with the sun's passage. But here's where it gets tricky. Alignments can be seductive. Human beings are pattern-seeking animals who will happily find order in noise. Is Stonehenge a calendar, a ceremonial sundial, a mnemonic for priests, or an ensemble of viewpoints layered with multiple observational functions? Key discoveries push in different directions. Excavations have recovered charcoal and post holes oriented in ways that support deliberate sidelines. Archaeoastronomical models show statistically significant relationships with solar and lunar cycles, and ethnographic analogies with later megalithic and ritual traditions suggest that societies without written calendars could maintain complex celestial knowledge by communal repetition and oral transmission. Yet competing theories insist on caution. One group of scholars argues that, yes, the solstitial alignments are intentional and fundamental to the monument's design, perhaps serving as a ritual calendar that structured communal gatherings. Another group emphasizes that while certain axes are notable, the monument also contains many other alignments that do not fit a neat calendrical model. Those researchers suggest Stonehenge may have been a multipurpose ritual center whose astronomical coincidences are real but not necessarily directive. A third perspective goes further and frames alignments as symbolic, where the sun's large-scale motions were appropriated into myth and ritual without being used for precise agricultural planning. Mythic elements have always shadowed these debates, from medieval accounts of Merlin moving stones to catch the sun's favor, to Victorian fantasies of druids performing solstice rites in robes and torches. The story of Stonehenge as a place where celestial and human dramas intersected is culturally persistent. Picture yourself on the plain at dawn, the chill in the air, the stones as silhouettes, a hush as the sun lifts and a single shaft of light slices the dark. How easy it is to imagine voices lifting in response, chants keyed to the sunrise as if the sky ordained a script. Still, for all the alignments and for all the careful measurement, we must be fair about the limitations of our evidence. The precision we can detect in the present day does not automatically map to how people 5 millennia ago conceptualized time, ritual, or community. There are also practical objections. The landscape has changed, stones have been moved, and the original sight lines may have included features now invisible, like timber posts or erected markers that guided viewing. Another complicating discovery is the avenue itself, which links Stonehenge to the River Avon and suggests processional movement timed by more than static observation. Could communal journeys timed to seasons have been the calendar, rather than a simple counting of days? Some scholars argue that the monument may have been an experiential calendar. People moved through spaces at particular times and enacted rites which taught the community when to plant or when to commemorate. Others think the alignments were primarily symbolic signals of control over cosmic knowledge by ritual elites. The reflective insight here is subtle. Whether Stonehenge functioned as a practical calendar or as a cosmic stage, the act of aligning architecture with the sky is itself an assertion that people felt embedded in a cosmos whose cycles mattered, and they were willing to shape stone and soil to mark that embedding. We still don't know whether the primary function was practical timekeeping, staged cosmology, or a braided mixture of both. But the sky is not only about sunrises and sunsets. The moon's long cycles, especially the 18.6-year lunar standstill, also imprint themselves on the Stonehenge landscape in ways that provoke intense debate. Archaeologists have pointed out features in the monument that could relate to lunar extremes, and a few researchers have argued that the builders might have recorded multi-decade observations, handing down knowledge across generations. Now, let's be fair, tracking an 18-year cycle requires not just one lifetime of observation but sustained cultural practices that ensure records or rituals are passed along. Evidence for such intergenerational memory is circumstantial. Post-hole alignments that could mark moonrise points, patterns in nearby monuments that track lunar maxima. But the ethnographic parallels are tantalizing. Many traditional societies remember cyclical celestial events through ritual calendars anchored by mythic narratives. Picture older generations recounting the time when the moon rose at a particular notch in the horizon and teaching younger people to mark it with stones or with stories. Such oral scaffolding is a plausible mechanism for maintaining awareness of long cycles. Still, for all the plausibility, skeptics caution that there are too many alignments in the landscape to confidently assign them function without imposing modern expectations. They warn that with enough points and lines, one can find an alignment for almost any object in the sky. The mythic overlay complicates the matter further. If Stonehenge is read through stories of giants or sun kings, the interplay of celestial signs with human drama becomes poetic and persuasive but not necessarily empirical. The reflective takeaway is this: whether or not Stonehenge served as a multi-century astronomical observatory, the very possibility that prehistoric peoples observed long cycles and invested them with ritual significance should expand our appreciation of their temporal imagination. We still don't know how exact their observations were or whether precision mattered as much as narrative coherence. Astronomical questions also reach into social power. If a small group of ritual specialists could predict seasonal changes by watching the sky, then knowledge could become a form of political capital, organizing labor, commanding food reserves, and scheduling large communal gatherings. Here, archaeology encounters anthropology. Ethnographies of societies with ritual elites show that calendar knowledge often reinforces social hierarchies. Barons of time can be barons of resources. Evidence that supports this interpretation at Stonehenge includes the scale of organization implied by construction and the presence of burial deposits that suggest individuals of special status. But there is a counterargument that ritual knowledge might have been widely participatory, public and communal rather than esoteric. Perhaps the alignments were taught openly at festivals, their knowledge shared in dance and song. Picture, then, not an inner circle of priests scribbling secret tables but a community performing the year in recurrent rites, a public pedagogy of time. Both models, centralized control and communal ritual instruction, have merit, and both have implications for how we imagine social power in Neolithic Britain. The reflective point: the sky may well have been a shared classroom where identity, time, and social order were learned in embodied practice, not merely a ledger of elite knowledge. We still don't know whether astronomical knowledge at Stonehenge was private property of the few or the collective inheritance of many. Finally, in this astronomical drama there is a human sensory element often overlooked: the performative and emotional experience of watching the sun and moon move in relation to the stones. Archaeology tends toward measurements and typologies, but the lived, visceral impression, the gooseflesh when first light flows along a trilithon, the hush that falls when a procession pauses to let the sun crest an axis, matters to understanding why the alignments were meaningful. The ancient builders may have shaped sightlines to choreograph attention and feeling. Imagine walking the avenue as smoke from communal fires mists the air, the crowd pressing close enough to feel the heat, the sound of a drum matching the heartbeat of the rising sun. Such sensory choreography could bind a group together in experience and memory more powerfully than abstract instruction. The reflective insight is that alignments are performative. They stage feeling as well as sight, and this dual nature makes them persistent in cultural memory. We still don't know the full repertoire of sensory practices that made those alignments count. So when we stand on Salisbury Plain and look up at the arc of the sky, what we confront is not a single solved astronomy but an ecology of possibilities. Stonehenge asks us to consider calendar, theater, pedagogy, power, and myth all at once. The stones are a script with many actors. The sun, moon, and stars are both props and protagonists. And while scientific models can test hypotheses about precision and function, the final layer, how those alignments felt, how they stitched individual lives into seasonal cycles, remains stubbornly human. We still don't know, And perhaps that uncertainty is an invitation. If the sky can be read in multiple ways, then our modern interpretations must remain open to being revised by new data, by experiments in archaeoacoustics and landscape archaeology, and by the humility of realizing how much of human meaning is performed rather than recorded. There is a part of Stonehenge that feels almost intimate, and that intimacy comes from flesh and bone, the burials, the cremations, the tiny traces of food and cloth and personal ornament that tell us, in the quietest way, who these people were. The one-sentence core of this mystery is simple and sharp. Stonehenge is not only a place of stone and sky but also a place of the dead, and the ways people were deposited there, burned, buried, placed in pits, adorned with objects from afar, raise more questions about identity, movement, and ritual than our neat categories can hold. Consider first the archaeological facts in their rough outlines. Around the primary phases of Stonehenge there are cremation deposits, scattered fragments of bones sealed under chalk, cut by pits and by the sockets where uprights once stood. These are often associated with the famous Aubrey holes and with later features that suggest repeated, generational returning to the same sacred center. Nearby barrows, earthen mounds sometimes containing burials of individuals with grave goods, sit like punctuation marks in the wider ritual landscape. Then there are exceptional burials found in the broader region, graves like that of the Amesbury archer, a richly furnished early Bronze Age burial near Amesbury, which included fine metalwork and arrowheads and which some researchers believe belonged to an individual who grew up far from Salisbury Plain, perhaps in Central Europe. There are the Boscombe bowmen, burials with grouped remains and grave goods that suggest both local ties and foreign echoes. Isotope analysis and ancient DNA over the last few decades have complicated our once local picture. Chemical signatures in teeth and bones sometimes show geographies that cross mountains and coasts, pointing to lives that began in distant hills and ended on this chalk plain. Yet the interpretation of these data requires humility. Mobility could mean many things: seasonal migration, marriage exchange, long-distance craft networks, or even the movement of ritual specialists summoned for particular events. The context of the burials matters too. Some cremations are carefully placed in relation to the stones themselves. Others appear messy, jumbled, or secondary, bones moved, reused, reburied, as if the dead were being drawn into new meanings as the monument evolved. Competing theories therefore sprout like grass in the ditch. One camp argues that Stonehenge functioned as a funerary center, a place where people brought their dead for special treatment, perhaps a place reserved for ancestors, or for elite lineages whose memories legitimated claims to land. Another suggests that the burials are the residue of pilgrimage. People came from far-flung places, died nearby, or were cremated elsewhere and their ashes brought here, and the monument became a concentrator of diverse mortuary practices. Yet another view regards these deposits as rites of closure or foundation, bones used as consecration for new building phases, as tokens of continuity that link new generations to the past. Mythic overlays are inevitable and persistent. Later folklore envisioned giants, kings, and heroes whose bodies lay beneath the stones. Medieval chroniclers speculated that Merlin and other magicians used the dead to sanctify the landscape. Modern sensationalists whisper of giant skeletons unearthed and hidden away. We must hold these tales lightly. Giant skeleton stories are almost always misreadings or fabrications, but we cannot ignore the power of myth to shape how later people understood the burial places. Picture yourself in the smoke and hush of a cremation rite, the heat of the pyre, the sound of bones cracking in flame, the murmur of names, the careful selection of which bones to collect and which to leave, the way of a small ceramic pot touched to a child's chest, the way grief and ritual braided into a choreography that validated a community's continuity. Archaeologists find the detritus, the charcoal flecked with bone, the tiny sherds of pottery, the occasional piece of copper or flint, but the choreography itself is invisible and must be imagined. Here too the reflective insight matters. Burial practices are the most intimate expressions of how a people imagined ancestry and belonging. Cremation, in particular, transforms body into a fragment that can be moved, shared, and placed. It makes death portable, which perhaps is why cremated fragments appear under stones and in sockets and patterns that suggest deliberate placement. At the same time, the presence of foreign goods and foreign isotopes pulls a thread that reaches beyond funerary practice into questions of identity and exchange. Beaker culture artifacts, distinctive pottery, metal daggers, and particular burial rites arrive in Britain in the 3rd millennium BC, and with them come new patterns of death, dress, and possibly speech. Was Stonehenge a node in a maritime and overland network that connected people from the coasts of Wales to the lowlands of the continent? The find of materials sourced from distant places, metals whose ores traced to other regions, stones whose chemistry maps to foreign quarries, suggests that Stonehenge was part of a web of exchange where people and objects moved and where the dead might be accompanied by goods that carried stories of origin. Yet the presence of foreign goods does not straightforwardly mean conquest or wholesale migration. It can mean prestige exchange, objects given as gifts to cement alliances, to mark marriages, to certify peace. The mythic possibility is irresistible. Imagine an envoy arriving bearing a polished copper blade whose copper gleams with an ocean blue patina, gifts given in the glow of torchlight to a person of standing who will be buried with the blade as a mark of their status. The reflective insight. Mortuary goods are language, and the language of goods at Stonehenge speaks of relationships, of whom you knew, whom you traded with, and whom you wanted remembered beside the stones. But there are still darker enigmas. Some burial patterns near Stonehenge show trauma, skull fractures, cut marks, signs of violent death. Does this indicate raiding and conflict, ritual sacrifice, or post-mortem manipulation as part of a rite? Interpretations diverge sharply. Violence and trauma in skeletal remains can reflect endemic conflict, competition over land, resources, or status, or they can be the result of ritualized forms of killing and post-mortem display that served cosmological ends. Some researchers point to the clustering of violent injuries within certain periods as evidence that the late Neolithic to early Bronze Age was not a peaceful ceremonial world but one riven by clashes as populations shifted and new cultural packages, like beaker pottery and metallurgy, spread. Others caution that skeletal trauma is a slippery indicator. A broken skull might owe more to an accidental fall than to a spear thrust, and taphonomic processes can mislead. Here again, myth rushes in, stories of war-loving chieftains or of sacrificial victims who appeased angry gods make for gripping narrative but are not always supported by data. Picture a moment of ambiguity, a body with a healed wound indicating survival into adulthood, a scar that shaped identity, perhaps honorable, lying near another whose injuries show no such healing. The reflective note is that death at Stonehenge, like life there, likely ranged across a spectrum, from celebrated founder to tragic outsider, and that the archaeological residue must be read with nuance. The burials also foreground questions of gender and social differentiation. Grave goods sometimes suggest distinctions in status and roles, objects associated with craft, with hunting, with adornment that may be gendered by analogy with other societies. But projecting modern categories onto prehistoric societies is fraught. Furthermore, the relative sparsity of preserved textiles, clothing, and organic markers complicates any firm assertion about roles. Yet the interplay of burial richness and placement near the monument strongly suggests social hierarchies of some kind. Certain individuals, whether elders, leaders, ritual specialists, or persons of special lineage, received interment practices that integrated them into the monument itself. Mythic narratives often assume kings and queens at the center of monumental work, and while we must be cautious about importing medieval models of monarchy into Neolithic contexts, the idea that some people exercise disproportionate influence, militarily, ritually, or economically, cannot be dismissed. Picture, once more, a mound opened in the dim morning light, the reveal of a carefully wrapped body, objects placed with intention, the community watching in silence, their identity folded around this moment. The reflective insight is that burial practice is a social mirror. It tells us who mattered, who was remembered, and the forms those memories took. Ultimately, the most poignant part of the burial mystery is the hole in our empathy. Names are gone, voices silent, songs unsung. Yet the tiny fragments of bone, the slivers of pot, the occasional grave bead insist. People lived here with desires, fears, and attachments not unlike ours. Stonehenge gathered those lives into a landscape where the living and dead met, where travelers from distant lands might be folded into a communal memory, where the sky and stone acted as witnesses. The scientific methods, radiocarbon, isotopes, DNA, will continue to revise our sense of who these people were and how they moved, but each technical advance layers new questions. Why were some ashes placed under particular stones and not others? Which narratives accompanied the dead as they entered the monument's reach? How did the social status of the living shape the treatment of the dead? We still don't know the intimate scripts that govern mourning and commemoration at Stonehenge, and perhaps we never will. The record is fragmentary, the voice is lost. Yet even in silence the stones press a kind of story into our hands, a story of people who shaped earth and sky and who, by how they chose to die and be remembered, left us a question that is also an invitation. We are invited to fill the lacunae with careful imagination, with the humility of methods, and with a reverence for the lives that now lie thin beneath our feet. We still don't know the exact rituals, the private names, the songs that mark each departure, but the burial evidence assures us of one thing: Stonehenge was as much a place for people as it was a place for stones. Stonehenge holds a secret you can sometimes hear if you stand very still. The stones sing, not in words but in the way they shape sound, and the mystery is that their acoustic signatures may have been part of the ritual power that gathered people here. Picture this as a one-sentence teaser. Stonehenge's stones are not silent monuments but instruments in a prehistoric soundscape, and the echoes they create may have tuned communal experience as surely as their silhouettes tuned sight. Archaeologists and experimentalists have, in recent decades, taken microphones, speakers, and batons to megalithic circles and found that certain arrangements produce surprising acoustic effects. Standing in the center of a stone ring can amplify voice in ways that a random scatter of rocks does not. Certain hollows in the ground can create low-frequency hums that press against the chest and alter mood. Historical context reminds us that sound is a portable and powerful sense. Before electric amplification, voice, drum, horn, and the rattle of shells were how people summoned one another, transmitted urgency, and encoded mythic texts for communal memory. Measurements, when they can be replicated, show that different stones have distinct resonant frequencies depending on weight, mineral composition, and how they rest on the earth. Some blue stones produce ringing tones when struck in a controlled way, a fact that may have drawn attention to them beyond their visual effect. But here's where it gets tricky. Acoustics in archaeology is an emergent field with a mix of robust lab measurements and speculative interpretation about social function. Key discoveries include experiments showing that hollows under certain megaliths can enhance low frequencies in the range human bodies feel as much as hear, and that the arrangement of uprights and lintels can create directional amplification. Speech or chant carried from the center out along avenues, or from the avenue into the center. Competing theories offer different readings. One argues that acoustic properties were noticed and deliberately used, stones chosen not only for color or provenance but for how they sang when struck, and architects arranging them to choreograph sound during rites. Another theory accepts that resonances exist but cautions against assuming intent. It suggests that observed acoustic phenomena could be incidental, later pressed into ritual importance, but not foundational in design. Yet another view frames sound as a social amplifier. Whether or not architects planned every frequency, once communities discovered that certain places made voice carry or created a somatic hum, they would have ritualized those experiences, making sound itself a technology of memory and authority. Mythic interpretations leap at these possibilities. Picture druidic figures or ancient bards whose words, amplified by stone, commanded weather or calmed angered ancestors. Legends of singing stones that answer a true-hearted supplicant with a low, empathetic note. Picture yourself at dawn or dusk, a small crowd pressed into the circle, the leader's voice rising and spilling across the plain in a cadence that seems to gather and hold attention. Heartbeats synchronizing, the crowd breathing together, a ritual not binding them. The reflective insight is that sound is embodied knowledge. Acoustic architecture teaches community in ways that sight alone cannot. And if Stonehenge hosted deliberate acoustic design, then the monument taught people how to feel as much as how to think. We still don't know whether the acoustic signature was a built intention or an emergent property turned sacred by practice. If the stones may have been instruments, then the plain itself acts like a stage set within a much larger theatrical geography. Rivers, barrows, trackways, and distant quarries compose a network whose logic is not yet fully mapped. Here's the teaser in one breath. Stonehenge belongs to a complex web of places: rivers that guided movement, barrows that marked lineage, and distant quarries whose stones were carried here, that together create a map of human relationships and obligations across hundreds of miles. The historical context is expansive, from the River Avon, which seems to act as a natural processional corridor, to the network of causewayed enclosures, cursus monuments, and burial mounds radiating outwards from the site. The landscape around Stonehenge is studded with traces of human activity spanning millennia. Measurements, spatial analyses, and GIS mapping reveal alignments and sight lines that connect Stonehenge to other monuments and to topographical features. Certain valleys frame the sunrise on solstice, particular barrows appear to form arcs when viewed from specific uprights, and trackways, some only visible in crop-marked surveys, link distant concentrations of material culture. Key discoveries have also come from the chemistry of artifacts: flint blades with raw material sourced from locales far beyond Salisbury Plain, pottery styles that echo continental fashions, and isotopic signatures in teeth that indicate movement from regions like the Welsh coast or continental lowlands. Competing theories address what such connectivity means. One proposes that Stonehenge was a pan-regional center drawing people in for pilgrimage, negotiation, and marriage alliances. The monument functions like an urban node in a prehistoric network, a place where diverse tribes and lineages met, exchanged goods, and negotiated terms of coexistence. Another interpretation emphasizes that these links could be the result of reciprocal gifting and long, slow networks of exchange, where certain items traveled not by centralized trade but by a chain of exchanges among kin groups. A third view argues for episodic centrality. Stonehenge might have had epochs of intense connectivity, periods when it functioned as a hub, interspersed with quieter phases when regional centers rose elsewhere. Myth always carpets these interpretations. Stories of lost tribes who brought stones as tokens of alliance, of ocean-faring visitors who carried news and goods across tidal currents, of ancestral processions that linked river to mound to stone in ceremonial choreography. Picture yourself walking along a riverbank in a mist, the Avon like a silver vein, small boats nosed into reeds, and an orderly procession bearing stones or cremation urns, people moving as if a map folded them together. The reflective insight is that monuments like Stonehenge are nodes in a humanly made geography. They derive meaning not only from their stones but from their relations: who came, why they came, and what obligations passed between them. We still don't know the full topology of those relationships, whether Stonehenge's prominence was always constant, or whether it rose and fell like tides, reshaping the social map with each crest and trough. These spatial and acoustic threads braid into a broader mystery: the role of innovation and technology in a place often imagined as primitive by modern readers. A simple teaser holds it. Stonehenge was produced by technologies, stoneworking, transport engineering, ritual choreography, that exceed many modern assumptions about prehistoric skill. We see this in the measurements of tool marks and in the geometry of mortise and tenon joints that cap sarcens with lintels, in the way some stones fit with precision that suggests templates or shared standards of measure. But here's where it gets tricky. Without written manuals or standardized measuring rods, how did builders ensure repeatable accuracy across decades? Key discoveries give hints. Experimental archaeology shows that teams using antler picks, stone mauls, and wooden levers can shape and move massive stones in surprisingly efficient ways when organization, technique, and local knowledge combine. Archaeologists have found traces of wooden sledges and of stone tools with polish consistent with heavy use. Geophysics reveals compacted approaches and causeways that would have smoothed transit. Competing theories differ on whether the necessary technologies were local innovations or shared knowledge transmitted along networks. One school emphasizes ingenuity. Local communities developed practical solutions: rafts on waterways, coordinated labor practices, and ritualized days of work that turned hauling into moral economy. Another highlights the possibility of specialist craft networks, teams of itinerant builders who traveled from site to site, bringing expertise in quarrying and erecting. Mythic accounts imagine master masons apprenticed to a secret lore, or sea-born engineers who taught islanders how to lever and load. Picture yourself at dusk in a quarry, a line of workers heaving on ropes, someone with a small plane of wood tapping to check flushness, the rhythm of labor like a carved metronome. The reflective insight is that technology and ritual co-produced each other, making things required social forms, and social forms were stabilized by the success of making. We still don't know whether the mainspring of innovation was mostly local or largely disseminated through itinerant specialists. Across these segments runs a theme: each method, sound experiments, spatial mapping, experimental archaeology, adds a lens, and each lens reveals possibilities rather than closing the case. Imagine standing now not at one stone but between several landscapes, the hum of a hollow when struck, the sight lines stretching to a distant ridge, the trace of ancient footsteps tucked into the riverbank. These are sensory cues, technical clues, and social signatures all braided into one epic question: what made people devote their lives to creating such an enduring, ambiguous place? The answer, if there is one, will likely be many answers braided together: cosmology and calendar, memory and monument, technology and theater, alliance and ancestry. We still don't know the balance among these forces, and that absence is precisely the invitation Stonehenge extends, an invitation to keep listening, testing, mapping, and imagining until the chorus of data, discipline, and human imagination sings in richer polyphony than any single voice can produce. So here we are, at the place where the threads of stone and soil, sound and sky, labor and myth finally knot together, not into a neat bow, but into a living, restless cord that pulls at us with questions as stubborn as lichen. Over the course of this journey we traced hands-on work and cosmic choreography, people who quarried, ferried, and raised stones, communities who tuned sight lines to the sun and moon, mourners who burned and buried their dead beneath the lintels, experimenters who showed us that the rocks themselves change the way the world sounds, mapmakers who laid the site within a braided network of river, barrow, and trackway, and craftsmen whose technology and practice hint at professional knowledge and improvisational genius. Those are the outlines. But the deeper story, the one that turns a list of facts into a human narrative, comes from the tensions between what we can measure and what we must imagine, between what the soil preserves and what the stones hide. That tension is the real thing Stonehenge offers us, not a solved riddle but a persistent, generative mystery that keeps inviting us to look closer. Think of Stonehenge not as a single object but as a long conversation across centuries. The monument did not appear whole. It accreted like the shell of an animal, layer upon layer, earthen banks, timber posts, bluestones, sarsen trilithons, each phase an answer to a previous question, each rearrangement a rebuttal or a reconciliation. People came, left marks, returned, and sometimes destroyed what came before. That dynamic process, build, unbuild, repurpose, reveals a culture that negotiated meaning through action more than through words. The act of moving a stone, of gathering a crowd, of placing an urn beneath a lintel was itself a statement about who belonged, who could command labor, which ancestors were worth remembering. We might never pluck from the ground a papyrus that reads, "On this day we did thus." But the choreography of labor is a language nonetheless. When you watch a crew lever a lintel into place in a reconstruction or an experiment, you see the grammar of that language: rhythm, repetition, discipline, technique, and an oral pedagogy that taught skill without writing. There is also an ethical, almost existential lesson here about the limits of our modern frameworks. We like tidy explanations, one purpose, one culprit, one date, but Stonehenge resists one-size-fits-all answers because it was never about one thing. It was a field of meanings simultaneously, a calendar for some, a funerary focus for others, a gathering place for trade and marriage, a stage for performance, and perhaps a map of social relations that stretched from the Preseli Hills to the continental shores. To accept complexity is not to surrender to confusion but to honor the intelligence of past people who layered their lives and their cosmologies over many generations. The monument asks that we shift from the modern compulsion to classify toward a more generous curiosity that can hold multiple truths at once. There is a particular kind of melancholy in that admission. We crave names because names humanize, but with Stonehenge the names have been washed away by weather and time. We have bones and chemistry, not biographies. We can tell that an individual ate a diet rich in seafood in childhood or that another traveled from a distant valley, but we cannot read their songs or hear their jokes. This absence should not become an excuse to fill silence with fantasy. Giants and aliens make excellent clickbait but do not help us understand why people devoted lifetimes to moving rock. Yet the absence also compels imagination used responsibly. When we picture the night of a solstice rite or the communal hauling of a 4-ton bluestone, those visualizations are not evidence but they are useful. They make the past tangible in the same way a restored building can make us understand architecture. Imagination, guided by the traces of evidence, is how we stitch empathy into cold data. Another revelation comes from thinking of Stonehenge as a social technology. Much like a law or a ritual, the monument is a device for ordering human behavior. Building a circle of stones requires more than strength. It requires organization, trust, and an agreed-upon narrative that binds disparate households into a working whole. The monument crystallized a social contract. People invested labor and food, leaders coordinated, specialist knowledge developed, and shared ritual practice reinforced cohesion. Whether those leaders were priestly elites, charismatic organizers, or rotating councils, the social work of the monument was real, measurable, and consequential. The presence of exotic goods, the isotopic signatures of migrants, and the grave goods of the Amesbury archer together indicate that Stonehenge was a nexus of relationships, the place where obligations were enacted and alliances declared. In this sense, Stonehenge is not just an archaeological site but a stage on which social life was rehearsed and rehearsed again until the actions themselves became the culture. We must also reckon with the monument's sensory design. It is easy to reduce prehistoric architecture to geometry and ignore how it would have felt: the smell of smoke, the press of a crowd, the low-frequency hum that may have vibrated through chest and bones. If certain stones ring when struck or certain hollows create a visceral vibration, then the site offered an experience not merely of sight but of body. Ritual is embodied knowledge, performed gestures, chanted lines, synchronous breath. The drama of a solstice sunrise, staged at the heel stone and along the avenue, would have been amplified by the communal pulse, the shared expectation, the drumbeat, the synchronized movement. Consider how memory works. Performed rituals are sticky. They create social memory more effectively than words alone. Stonehenge is thus a monument to embodied pedagogy where time, authority, and identity were taught and retaught each year in the embodied practices of the community. And then there is the long weave of landscape connections. The monument is not an island, it is a node in a vast web of places linked by rivers, ridges, and travel ways. To understand Stonehenge fully, we must think in networks, not in single monuments. Trade items from distant quarries, pottery styles reminiscent of continental neighbors, and burials bearing non-local isotopic signatures all show that prehistoric Britain and Europe were porous, socially animated spaces. The River Avon becomes a silver highway in this image, carrying people and objects in ways that created social density on Salisbury Plain. Pilgrims, diplomats, kin, and craftspeople converged in this theater. Stonehenge mediated their encounters. If the monument gave a place to meet, it also offered a script for interaction: where to stand, what to say, what to give, thus structuring social life across a landscape greatly larger than any single tribe's territory. Finally, there is a moral and aesthetic humility embedded in the silence of the stones. We are a species skilled in imagining causal chains, and yet the most powerful legacy of Stonehenge may be its ability to keep questions alive. There is no shame in not knowing. Indeed, the site invites patience. It encourages scientific curiosity. More surveys, more careful digs, better isotopic maps, and it encourages a cultural patience, an acceptance that some human meanings are encoded not in single artifacts but in long rhythms of practice that leave ambiguous traces. Each generation of scientists adds its own layer of interpretation, revises previous models, and sometimes overturns cherished theories. That process is not failure, it is the slow, collective work of understanding a world not built to be read like a ledger but to be lived inside. So what should you take away from all of this as you close your listening? First, that Stonehenge is less a monument to one idea than to the human capacity for layered meaning-making. It is an archive of decisions: where to quarry, when to haul, whom to honor with a fire's coals placed under a stone. Second, the site is a reminder that social life often makes things that outlast individual lifetimes. Projects of memory and meaning are what knit generations together. Third, our modern desire for closure must give way to a more generous curiosity. We can hold competing interpretations: astronomy and ritual, funerary center and pilgrimage hub, acoustic theater and social technology, without insisting that one answer annihilates the others. Each possibility enriches the picture. If there is a final tenderness in this, it is that Stonehenge asks us to remember our own place in history. We are as much makers as mourners, as much listeners as talkers. Standing anywhere near the stones, you feel time layered beneath your feet, the slow, patient work of weather, the sudden choreography of a communal build, the decades of rites that turn stone into meaning. We borrow from that deep temporal patience when we read the site with humility, using the best tools of science even as we allow our imaginations to mend the gaps the soil cannot fill. The monument's unanswered questions are therefore not failures but invitations, to study more, yes, but also to wonder more. To listen, perhaps, to the small sound a struck stone makes or to the way the plain smells before a storm, and to imagine the chorus of voices that once circled these rocks. So let us leave the stones where they stand and carry their lesson, that the human impulse to make, whether it is to mark a solstice, to remember a beloved, to assert alliance, or merely to be part of something enduring, is the thread that connects us to those who raised those lintels. The mystery is not merely the stone's provenance, or the exact geometry of an alignment. It is the stubborn, luminous fact that people devoted themselves to a project whose meaning they knew in ways we can only begin to glimpse. That, perhaps, is the greatest legacy, a reminder that meaning accrues through action and ritual, that monuments are shared enterprises, and that memory itself is a social craft handed down in work and song. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.